I was standing in the driveway watching my sister drive away in a brand new car, paid for with my inheritance, when my phone rang, and everything my parents thought they'd secured unraveled in one quiet hospice call. Family betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes with a smile, paperwork, and silence. I trusted my parents to honor my grandmother's wishes, but instead, they rewrote my future to favor my sister. What none of them expected was that even from a hospice bed, Grandma still had one final move that would change all of our lives. When my grandmother passed, she didn't leave behind confusion or vague promises. She left clarity. She had always been deliberate, the kind of woman who labeled folders, double-checked signatures, and spoke plainly about her intentions. She told me, more than once, that what she was leaving me wasn't about indulgence or status. It was about stability. A foundation. Something that would give me breathing room in a world that rarely offers it. When my parents sat me down after her funeral and told me everything was handled, I believed them. I wanted to believe them. They were my parents, after all, and grief has a way of softening suspicion. For months, I carried on with my life assuming that chapter was closed. I planned carefully, thinking about practical things, paying down debt, maybe going back to school, finally feeling like I wasn't one unexpected expense away from panic. There was comfort in that belief, even if the money hadn't arrived yet. I trusted the delay. I trusted their reassurance. Looking back, that trust feels naïve, but at the time, it felt natural. Families are supposed to protect you, not take from you. The truth didn't come out all at once. It slipped through the cracks of a casual conversation, an offhand comment about my sister's big surprise. When I saw the new car sitting in the driveway, shiny, expensive, unmistakably new, something in my stomach dropped. The numbers didn't add up. The timing didn't make sense. And when I finally asked the question I'd been avoiding, the answer came wrapped in justification. They told me they'd used my inheritance to help the family. They said my sister needed it more. They called it a family decision, as if that phrase could erase the fact that the decision had been made without me. What hurt most wasn't the money itself. Money can be earned again, rebuilt over time. What hurt was the realization that my role in my own life had been reduced to an afterthought. That my grandmother's wishes, and my future, had been quietly overridden by convenience and favoritism. I wasn't angry in the explosive way people expect. I was hollow. The kind of hurt that settles in your chest and makes you question every memory, every assurance that came before. In that moment, I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. My voice had never really mattered in that household. Decisions were made for me, about me, without me. The inheritance wasn't the first time. It was just the first time it was impossible to ignore. The car became a symbol of that truth, parked in plain sight, impossible to look away from, and as painful as that realization was, it also marked the beginning of something else, clarity. Because once you see where you stand, you can finally decide where you're willing to go from there. When I confronted them, I wasn't angry at first. I was calm, almost hopeful, believing there had to be some misunderstanding, some detail I didn't know yet that would make everything make sense. I explained how hurt I felt, how the inheritance wasn't just money to me, but a promise from my grandmother, something that represented trust and belief in my future. My parents listened with tight smiles and folded arms, and then they said it. They told me I was being dramatic. They said my sister needed it more. They said I'd understand one day. In that moment, something inside me quietly cracked. That sentence didn't come out of nowhere. It carried the weight of every time my needs had been minimized. Every moment I'd been told to be patient, to be strong, to not make a fuss. Growing up, I'd learned early that harmony mattered more than honesty. If I stayed quiet, if I didn't complain, things would stay peaceful. I convinced myself that was what loyalty looked like. I believed that being understanding meant being overlooked. That love was proven by how much you were willing to sacrifice without acknowledgement. Hearing them justify their choice so casually felt like being erased. They didn't ask how I would manage without that money or what plans I'd made around it. They didn't see the nights I stayed up worrying about stability, or the years I spent trying to prove I was responsible, dependable, deserving. To them, my sister's immediate comfort outweighed my long-term security, and they framed it as practicality, as parenting, as something noble. But it wasn't noble. It was convenient. What hurt the most was realizing how easily they dismissed my pain. There was no apology, no pause, no moment of reflection. Just a quiet expectation that I would swallow it like I always had. That I would nod, back down, and accept their version of fairness. In that instant, I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. I was always the one expected to adapt, to understand, to be the bigger person. My sister was allowed to need. I was expected to cope. I left that conversation feeling smaller than I had in years. Not because they'd taken something from me, but because they'd confirmed a truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't unreasonable. I was simply finally naming something that had always been there. Favoritism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, wrapped in excuses and smiles, telling you that your pain is imaginary and your needs are optional. That realization was painful, but it was also freeing. It forced me to confront the lie I'd lived with for so long. That acceptance had to be earned through silence. I began to understand that loyalty that requires self-erasure isn't loyalty at all. It's survival. And for the first time, instead of shrinking myself to fit their expectations, I allowed myself to feel the truth fully. I deserved fairness, I deserved to be heard, and I deserved to stop apologizing for wanting what was rightfully mine. What they didn't know was that my grandmother, even in hospice, had sensed something was wrong long before anyone said a word to her. Even as her body weakened and the days blurred together, her mind remained clear in the way that truly mattered. She had spent a lifetime reading people, understanding silences, and recognizing when something didn't sit right. The tone in my parents' voices when they visited her, the way they avoided specifics, the rushed reassurances that everything was taken care of. All of it added up in her quiet moments alone. She didn't accuse, didn't argue, didn't create drama. She simply listened, remembered, and trusted her instincts. From her hospice bed, surrounded by the soft hum of medical machines and the steady rhythm of borrowed time, she asked for her phone. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was calm, deliberate, almost routine, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She called the attorney, who had handled her affairs for decades, the one person she trusted to act without emotion or bias. Her voice was soft, but her words were precise. She didn't say she suspected wrongdoing. She didn't point fingers. She simply requested a final review of her estate, reminding him of her original intentions and asking him to ensure that they were being honored exactly as written. That call carried more weight than anyone realized. It wasn't fueled by anger or resentment. It was rooted in responsibility. She understood that a legacy isn't just what you leave behind, but how faithfully it's carried forward. In her mind, allowing silence to replace truth would be a betrayal not just of me, but of the values she'd lived by. Even in her final days, she refused to let convenience override fairness. She believed that love should never be expressed through imbalance, and that family should protect, not exploit, the vulnerable. The attorney listened carefully, asking gentle questions, taking careful notes. He heard in her pauses and careful phrasing that this mattered deeply. After the call ended, processes were quietly set in motion. Documents reviewed, timelines checked, transfers examined. Nothing explosive, nothing immediate. Just truth doing what it always does when given space surfacing. My grandmother never followed up, She didn't need to. She trusted that once the wheels were turning, they would turn in the right direction. What stays with me most is not the legal outcome, but the strength behind that moment. Weak in body, she still chose clarity over comfort. She chose to act when it would have been easier to rest. That single call wasn't about control. It was about protection. It was her way of standing beside me one last time, ensuring that her voice didn't fade just because her strength had. Even from a hospice bed, she proved that integrity doesn't weaken with age, and that love, when rooted in principle, can reach far beyond a final breath. That call set off a chain reaction no one in my family saw coming. What sounded like a routine check in from an attorney became a hard stop on everything they thought was already settled. The accounts were frozen without warning, payments halted mid-process, and signatures that had once felt final were suddenly treated like unanswered questions. Overnight, certainty turned into scrutiny. The same paperwork my parents had waved away as handled was now being pulled apart line by line, each clause examined under a light they never expected to face. I watched the shift happen in real time. The calm, almost smug confidence they carried for months evaporated, replaced by clipped conversations and locked doors. Phone calls were taken in hushed tones. Emails were reread obsessively. For the first time, they weren't controlling the narrative. The system they thought they'd quietly maneuvered through had paused and asked a simple, devastating question: was this truly what Grandma wanted? And in that pause, everything changed. What struck me most was how quickly their certainty unraveled once accountability entered the room. They had justified their actions so easily before, telling themselves it was practical, that it was fair, that I would be fine. But when faced with legal language and professional distance, those excuses lost their power. There was no room for emotional spin, no space to hide behind family dynamics. Facts replaced feelings, and intentions were measured against written truth. The re-examination wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it seem. There were no shouting matches or slammed gavels. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: silence. Weeks of waiting, requests for clarification, formal letters that spoke in calm, neutral tones while dismantling every assumption my parents had relied on. Each document felt like a mirror being held up, reflecting not just what they'd done, but why they'd believed they could get away with it. For me, the loudest part of the truth wasn't the legal process. It was the emotional reversal. The power imbalance shifted without me saying another word. I didn't need to argue or defend myself anymore. The truth did the work for me. It spoke in timestamps, signatures, and intent, proving that sometimes the strongest response to betrayal is patience. I realized then that being quiet hadn't made me weak. It had made me ready. As the process unfolded, I understood something deeper about justice. It doesn't always arrive with applause or instant satisfaction. Often, it comes slowly, methodically, stripping away false confidence until only reality remains. Watching my parents face that reality was painful, but it was also clarifying. It confirmed what I had felt all along: that wrong choices, no matter how quietly made, leave a trail. In the end, the truth didn't need my anger to be heard. It didn't need raised voices or fractured relationships to prove its weight. It rose on its own, steady and undeniable, reminding me that honesty has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And when it does, it carries a volume no argument can ever match. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice or savor the moment the way people expect you to when justice finally tilts in your favor. When the inheritance was restored, there was no rush of triumph, no urge to say, "I told you so." What I felt instead was quiet, steady relief, like finally standing on solid ground after months of sinking sand. It wasn't a victory over my parents or my sister. It was validation that I hadn't imagined the betrayal, that my sense of right and wrong was still intact, and that my grandmother's wishes had weight, even when others tried to bend them. Standing firm didn't mean becoming harsh or cold. It meant refusing to shrink myself to keep the peace. For so long, I'd been conditioned to believe that harmony required silence. That being, the good one, meant swallowing disappointment and moving on. But silence had cost me more than money. It had cost me self-respect. When I finally chose clarity over comfort, I realized something powerful. You can be calm and still be unmovable. You can speak softly and still draw a line that no one gets to cross. There were moments when I was tempted to lash out, to let years of buried resentment spill over. It would have been easy to weaponize the truth, to make them feel as small as I had felt. But cruelty would have given them an excuse to dismiss me, to reduce everything to emotions instead of facts. By staying grounded, by letting the truth speak for itself, I took away their ability to rewrite the story. Courage, I learned, isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the decision to remain steady when everything in you wants to react. What surprised me most was how much strength came from that restraint. I didn't need their apology to feel whole again. I didn't need their approval to move forward. The restoration of the inheritance wasn't about reclaiming money, it was about reclaiming my agency. It was proof that I was allowed to expect fairness, that I didn't have to earn respect by sacrificing myself. That experience reshaped how I see conflict and self-worth. Standing up for yourself doesn't require you to become someone you don't recognize. It doesn't demand bitterness or revenge. It asks for honesty, patience, and the willingness to endure discomfort without backing down. Clarity gave me direction. Courage gave me endurance. Together, they carried me through a moment that could have hardened me, but instead made me more grounded. In the end, I walked away lighter, not because I won something, but because I stopped abandoning myself. I learned that validation doesn't always come as applause, it often arrives as peace. And that peace, earned through standing firm without cruelty, is something no one can take from you. My grandmother didn't just leave me money. She left me a lesson that took me years to fully understand, because it wasn't written in legal language or stamped on official papers. It was woven into the way she lived, the way she watched, and the way she finally acted when it mattered most. She showed me that your worth is not something that can be debated, negotiated, or traded for convenience. It isn't decided by who is louder, needier, or more favored in the moment. Your worth exists whether others acknowledge it or not, and no amount of denial can erase it. She also taught me that real love never steals. Love doesn't quietly take from one child to reward another, and then dress it up as responsibility or what's best for the family. Love doesn't ask one person to shrink so someone else can shine. When people justify unfairness in the name of unity, what they're really doing is protecting comfort, not connection. My grandmother understood that, and she refused to let imbalance masquerade as care. Growing up, I thought fairness was something you asked for, something you argued your way into. She taught me that true fairness is a value, not a negotiation. It lives in the choices people make when no one is watching, and in the lines they refuse to cross, even when crossing them would be easier. Watching her insist on that principle, especially when she was weak, tired, and nearing the end of her life, showed me that strength doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it makes one quiet decision that echoes longer than any confrontation ever could. What stayed with me most was how calmly she acted. There was no anger, no need to punish or shame. She didn't move from resentment. She moved from clarity. She saw the situation for what it was and corrected it. Not to prove a point, but to preserve a standard. In doing so, she reminded me that protecting your boundaries doesn't make you selfish. It makes you honest. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, is the foundation of any family that claims to be built on love. True family, she showed me, isn't about equal appearances or forced harmony. It's about equity, accountability, and respect. It's about refusing to sacrifice one person's future to ease another's present. Fairness can be awkward. It can create tension. It can force hard conversations and expose uncomfortable truths. But without it, what you're left with isn't peace. It's silence. And silence has a way of eroding relationships from the inside out. Her lesson reshaped how I see myself and others. I no longer measure my value by how much I'm willing to give up to keep others comfortable. I no longer confuse love with obligation or loyalty with self-erasure. I understand now that being part of a family doesn't mean accepting injustice to prove devotion. It means honoring each person's dignity, even when doing so requires courage. In the end, her greatest inheritance wasn't financial security, it was self-respect. She gave me permission to stand firm without becoming bitter, to seek fairness without becoming cold, and to believe that love, when it's real, never asks you to be less so someone else can have more. This story isn't about a car or money. It's about knowing your value and trusting that truth has power, even when whispered from a hospice bed. If you're ever doubted, remember this: integrity outlives manipulation, and what's meant for you will always find its way back.